All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Ashley Rumschlag. I'm the CEO and president of domesticshelters.org. I am joined today by Rachel Myers, our digital services specialist, and Hannah Craig, our senior content strategist and creator. Hannah and Rachel will be monitoring the chat and Q&A box today throughout the presentation. We are so excited today to be joined once again by our EBodyguard panel of experts. Today, we're going to be focusing on law enforcement and their perspective. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. First off, closed captionings are available for the webinar. If you would like to enable these, please click More in the menu bar and select Show Subtitles. We will provide a transcript of the webinar within a week of the presentation. Just a reminder, all attendees are in listen-only mode, so your camera and your microphones are turned off. If you have a question, please enter that in the Q&A box. We prefer chat to be used for communication between between attendees. And if you have any technical issues with the webinar, please add those to the chat and we will assist the best we can. I'll go faster. All right, so we will send a certificate. Like I said, the transcript, we are recording today's webinar, so we'll send a playback recording to everyone who attends today, and then we'll also post that on our website. And then we'll also send, if we mention any additional resources, we'll include those in a shared folder. And then just a quick reminder for anyone who may be joining who's not familiar with domesticshelters.org. We are a free online domestic violence resource. We offer a searchable database of all the different programs in the US and Canada, as well as a robust library of shareable content. So mostly articles, but we also have videos, lists, and other educational content. We offer custom data reports in our data center. And any US-based shelter is eligible for a free wish list that allows donors from anywhere in the world to ship items like diapers, laundry detergent, and other items that you need to serve your clients. And finally, we offer a Facebook group that allows, we have two different ones, one for victims and survivors, and then another based for advocates. And I know Rachel is busy dropping a bunch of links in the chat right now. So if you're interested in any of those, please check out those links. And then just another reminder that all of our webinars are archived on our website. So if you want to share this webinar, this will be available the next week. But we also have over, I think, 25 webinars available at any time. And you can always email us. Oh, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. At info@domesticshelters.org if you'd like a certificate of attendance, but also if you just want to reach out and share anything with us or ask us any questions, we're here to help. All right, so a big thank you to EBodyguard for partnering with us on this webinar series. EBodyguard has created a proprietary technology to reduce barriers so everyone can reach 911 and be supported before and after a crime has been committed. Every individual deserves the right to feel primal safety, and this is the core of the work they're doing. Since EBodyguard does not rely on cell towers, which may have dead zones for emergency communication, they are able to provide access to 911 using GPS technology when help is needed. They recently released a new version of the EBodyguard app that includes the safety card. People who use the EBodyguard app to connect with their nearest 911 call center will not only share their location data, they'll also be sharing critical information about their medical history, information about their family members, and details about people that might want to harm them, including protection orders. The last piece of information is critical for victims of abuse and helps them to feel heard. Excuse me. Okay, here's another look at what that feature looks like in the app. In all this information, it gives 911 telecommunicators and law enforcement a clearer picture of what is happening and how they need to respond, even if it's the caller's first time calling for help in that jurisdiction, or in cases where the caller doesn't feel safe enough to say anything. All this information is also available without a court order. This image is an image of a computer-aided dispatch screen that shows the user's location, and at the bottom left is a link that the telecommunicator clicks when the safety card information is available. And this next image shows what that safety card information looks like. So it shares relevant and really important information with the telecommunicator that can help bring safety to the person that's calling quicker. Okay, and just one quick other thing, the safety EBodyguard is more than just the app. So it is a smart discovery platform, a single FBI CJIS compliant, vendor agnostic, integrated platform. The digital evidence and discovery from the community through the court system flows through in an automated fashion. It is no longer siloed into a variety of different systems that don't communicate and is accepted in the US courts of law. Okay. If you'd like to reach out for more information with EBodyguard, here's their information. They do have a 1-888 number and an email address that you can reach out to them. EBodyguard's CEO and founder, Melissa Faithhart, is on today's call. And if you have any questions, she'll be on there here to address them. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into our panel today. We do have two new faces joining us. Monica Kearney is the Executive Director at Safe Space in Lewisburg, North Carolina, and she will be providing insight as a domestic violence expert. Kimberly Spejas is the Chief Resource Prosecutor at North Carolina Conference of District Attorney, will be lending expertise in the area of the prosecutor. And then returning to our panel, some familiar faces, and Heather Joyner, who is now the Executive Director of Operations at EBodyguard. She'll be sharing her wealth of experience as a PSAP and 911 telecommunicator. And we're going to spend a lot of time hearing from John Jackson today, who is a former chief of police at the city of Greenwood Village, Colorado, who will serve as our law enforcement expert. So let's go ahead and I'll stop my screen share. Welcome everyone onto the screen here. All right, we're going to kick it off with John, as to be expected. So John, welcome and thank you for being here.
Wonderful to be here with you. Again, thank you for the invitation, and I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with the group.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first question I have for you is, what is the process that occurs the moment the patrol is sent to the scene of a domestic violence response call? What is occurring as they're traveling to the scene?
This is the start of what begins to be just a tremendous amount of flow of information. So generally speaking, a call is going to come into a 911 center, and these 911 centers, which are angels in hiding, they begin to gather all of the information and things that we need as we get to the scene in the field. So the flow of information starts there, comes to the officers in the field visually and audio now. Most agencies have mobile data computers in their cars. So the officers are receiving information by the dispatchers directly from their computer and audio. So they're talking and they're beginning to gather all the information that they need. So it's a process. And what they really are looking for is what is happening currently on the phone in live format from the dispatchers. That's the most important thing that we can get. It's a live feed of information. They're also beginning to coordinate a response. So in that process, they're getting to the scene, they're learning as much as they can learn, and they're trying to pull everything together to be able to try and make a contact. So as that's happening, people are listening, people are moving in that direction, and just trying to understand what they're going to need to help the people when they arrive.
Got it.
This is a process of kind of looking, listening, assessing before you contact, because backup officers are going to be required a lot of the time by policy. And so officers are following their departmental policies, and as they arrive, they're coordinating that response with the other incoming officers. Rarely, unless it's exigent circumstances, is an officer going to get on scene and go rushing up to the front door.
Right, and this is specific to a domestic violence case that backup would be required, or is there other types of calls?
There are other situations that require mandatory backup, like an active shooter situation. Right. We have policies that deal with teams that approach those things, but there's always a caveat that if something horrible or tragic is happening, there's an exigency, which means an urgency. Law enforcement is going to immediately do what needs to do to protect the sanctity of life.
Right, very good. So today, what type of information is provided by a 911 telecommunicator to the officer before they arrive on the scene for a domestic violence call? What additional information, maybe something that isn't available, would be helpful?
Well, we're going to be looking for things that are happening right now. And this is the process of really gathering that data. So we all know who, what, where, when, why, how, those different questions. But at this point, we're really focused on who, what, and where. We want to know things in advance. So we want to know things like who is on scene and what maybe their relationship is. Are there any injuries? Are there any weapons? Any prior contacts at the home? Are there alcohol and drugs? Maybe kids and pets that we might approach, because the kids and the pets become then something that has to be attended to a little differently. History tells us that dogs don't like uniforms. And so we want to know if there is a big dog that's going to be in the backyard or something around. So if we know there's injuries, these 911 operators can then again begin to patch in additional resources. So they're going to be pulling across medical personnel if somebody says they've been shot or they're bleeding profusely. So medical personnel can be coming that way, and then law enforcement will begin to stage them to come in and respond as needed once the scene is stable and safe.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, John. We're actually going to turn over to Heather for a couple of questions. Heather, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So how do telecommunicators support the law enforcement officer as they arrive on scene to a domestic violence call? I know John's kind of alluded to the fact that it's a lot of information, but can you share from your perspective?
Yeah, he referenced like those 5 W's, the where, what, when, who, and weapons. In these cases of domestic violence calls that we're dispatching law enforcement or medical responders, first responders too, we focus on the who and the weapons. We want to know, like John said, who's on scene, who was the caller, are there any other children or any other people in the residence or the location of where this incident may be occurring. We're also looking about, previous calls from this location to see if there may be history here, what type of incidents have occurred in the past. We're also checking for anything outstanding. If there's an active ex parte or protection order or no contact, if there is any outstanding warrants. Sometimes in DV cases, there may be warrants that have not been served. So we want the officers to know if they're responding to a situation or a scene where this person may be on scene, so they're aware of that. Weapons, anything may be used as a weapon, but we're focusing on those things that are not traditional typically in a home, like machetes, long, firearms or guns or, knives that, can really create for some damage if somebody were to respond. Like John said, they're not always going to just walk into the door or walk up to a door without knowing what they're walking into. So we do focus on a lot of that. We also want to keep their scene safety in mind. We want to know if there's any hazards that have occurred in the area, and just basically giving them updates as we're getting updated by those callers who may be reporting an incident at that location.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And so it sounds like those are kind of key elements that are probably across the board for all calls, but really important for a domestic violence call.
Absolutely.
And it seems like those could really make a difference in terms of the outcome of the call if you are able to extract that information and pass it along to law enforcement.
Absolutely. And sometimes, often in these cases, you may not have a caller who is going to speak with the telecommunicator, right, and we have to rely on background noises or what's not being said. Or, in the case of, I know in the opening presentation, you showed the safety card. So in those situations, if we had a caller who was utilizing the safety card feature through the Versatile app, it would give us that information that we wouldn't be able to obtain otherwise in a voice call necessarily. Sometimes you just hear children callers who will call on behalf of parents or individuals that are fighting, and telecommunicators have to be skilled to deal with children callers just as well as adult callers, and then those who are not speaking at all.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks so much. You actually answered both my questions in your first answer, so I appreciate that. I'm going to turn back to John, and then we'll go to Kimberly for a question. So one question for you, John. Of the thousands of domestic violence calls you have personally attended in your law enforcement career, how many arrests can you recall making because there was actual evidence like at the scene?
Well, there's a very high percentage of those arrests are based on physical evidence at the scene. having been to many of these, as you pointed out, sometimes we only get the information from an open line, a 911 call where it's an active fight going on and all you can hear, and we're hearing from the 911 center that things are being broken and we're trying to figure it out. And sometimes you end up having to then force entry into the home. So the physical evidence starts even before the officers arrive on scene because we're gathering all those recordings. Once we're on scene, everything is potentially evidence that Kimberly is going to need. We have to establish and walk our way through things like what is reasonable suspicion. That then moves to what's probable cause. Probable cause really is just that someone probably did something. Now that's a very simple view of probable cause, but I have to get enough evidence to show beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a different legal standard that Kimberly will talk about in a court of law. So we do that by gathering evidence. And it starts with things like body-worn cameras, anything physical at the scene, statements that we can take. Those are all very good things that we can show in a case or court to prove what is the crime that's alleged. We have to deal with what we are able to see and prove as opposed to what we are told. Now, that doesn't mean what we're just told doesn't matter. It means that we have to corroborate it and pull it together. It's difficult because we recognize there are many emotions and relationships, and it's a really charged situation that you're just infusing police resources into actually blindly. And the best thing that law enforcement can do is get in and settle it down and keep everybody safe, but then begin to separate everybody and start to gather that evidence in a calm way. Now, it has always mystified me how 911 operators can over the phone begin to calm the situation. And we see it over and over and over where their work is our safety and our livelihood in the field. They calm it, they insert us, and we figure out where to go to then hand it over to Kimberly. And we'll talk about the process next, but we have to have evidence. We need people to participate in their own safety, and we recognize that's hard. So we're going to give you the options of what that takes. But quite simply put, we can use circumstantial evidence, things that aren't able to be proven, but we're going to cut up carpet if there's a blood stain. We may take a bullet and carve it out of the wall if somebody shot into the wall. We're going to take the knife that's laying on the floor and physically take custody of it so we can prove it and give it to the courts to say, here's what proves what we allege and what we think happened. And it is not an easy process sometimes when people want to either not be forthcoming or hide things or throw stuff away or make it to where something maybe didn't happen the way it actually did. It is really, really, really important that we gather that evidence, we keep people safe. But to answer your question directly, the highest of percentages, 90 plus, there is some level of evidence. You just have to find it and ask the right questions.
Right. And so you are most likely able to make an arrest at the scene based on the evidence that you're finding. In most cases.
Colorado, it goes more than most likely. Some states have probable cause for arrest with enhancers. In Colorado, we have mandatory arrest. And if there is probable cause to arrest someone with a domestic violence relationship, we are mandated to make an arrest. Now, that's a very high bar. It is the only crime I am aware of where it is mandatory by state law that an arrest be made. It's not negotiable. I can literally watch you kill Kimberly and let you go and not have to arrest you. But if you and Kimberly are married, I have to arrest you for killing her. It's mandated by law. This is the training that officers are getting, and it is an incredibly high bar where there is no discretion. And once we figure that out, we are bound to make certain things happen to create a safe scenario for victims as they begin to process what's happened to them.
Wow. Yeah. Thanks for going to, I'm sure we'll circle back to the arrest process as well later on. But I want to turn it over to Kimberly for some questions here. Thanks for being here today, Kimberly. So great to have you and great to meet you. This is our first time meeting.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a huge honor to be here with such a distinguished panel.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are the key elements that prosecution needs in the prosecution summary to determine if the case can prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 12?
That's a great question. And before I answer it directly, I think it's important for us to note that prosecutors are reviewing a ton of files every week. And those files and the number of files that they're reviewing to determine if they can proceed forward and prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt is growing. And the reason that that's important, and it's important to evidence gatherers, whether they are people that are working with dispatch or law enforcement, or folks that are working with victims of crime and their families after the offense, because you can still glean evidence to prove a criminal case after the offense. It's important that everybody understands that with that volume of files that are coming into the prosecutor's office every day, there are some things that you can highlight in your prosecution summary that'll move it to the top of the stack, for example, and really give a prosecutor an opportunity to see that this is a crime that they can prove and that they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. John mentioned that earlier, and that's such an important standard for people to understand because it is the highest standard of proof in court, period. Civil or criminal, it's the highest standard of proof. And it doesn't mean that we have to prove something beyond all doubt or beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it is a higher standard than the reasonable suspicion standard that John recently mentioned, and then also the even probable cause standard. A crime was probably committed and this person probably committed it. We really have to prove every element. And that's the first thing that is important to recognize must be in a prosecution summary. A prosecution summary has to clearly show and include the facts and the evidence that support each element of each crime that has been charged against the defendant. It's also important that the summary highlights for the prosecutor any evidence that was collected to support each of these elements and to support each of the charges or crimes. That could be physical evidence, which has been mentioned already today. There's a ton of different types of physical evidence that might be present at a crime scene. It could also be body cam or other video evidence. It could include any admissions or confessions. And that's something that people use those words interchangeably, and they really are very, very different. In criminal cases, it is extremely rare that I have, as a prosecutor, a true confession where an offender or a defendant has confessed to every element of the crime. What's more likely is that I have a series of admissions. And so those things are really important. Those admissions help us prove elements. Those admissions help us corroborate, if you will, the physical evidence that John was talking about and the digital evidence that we've spoken about and will continue to speak about. But oftentimes people use those words interchangeably. And a confession is, I did it. This is how I did it. This is what happened. I did everything that I am charged with. And we rarely have that. Often we'll have, yes, I was angry, which is an admission, not a confession that a crime was committed. Or yes, I put my hands on the victim, but that doesn't mean that they, strangled the victim. So we'll have some admissions, and those are important, and they're important things to put into a summary, and the details of those admissions. I have seen a lot of prosecution summaries that say the defendant confessed to the crime. And when I was a new prosecutor, I'd get really excited about that. And I'd start to look through the file and try to find that confession. As now that I've been doing this work over 20 years, I recognize that people sometimes don't use that word correctly. But you want that in the summary. If there are admissions that the defendant has made, that's a good thing to put in the summary. The other thing that's really important is oftentimes law enforcement are going to try to interview people when they're on the scene. And so you want to make sure that in that summary, it's clear to the prosecutor that the defendant's rights have been met if the defendant is in custody. Sometimes on the scene, they're not in custody, and so those Miranda rights might not be required at that point. But once the defendant's been taken into custody, if there was any statements that were taken from the defendant, we want to make sure we know that their rights have been met, that the officers have provided those Miranda rights so that we can use any admissions or even confessions, if we get them, that might be present. And then lastly, it's important for law enforcement and other fact gatherers to understand that your summary is your first opportunity for a prosecutor to see how thorough you are in your investigation. So when I look at a summary and it's well organized, it's detailed, what that tells me is not just that I'm going to have an even more robust file once I get in the full file. It also lets me know something about the officer or the fact gatherer that wrote that report. It tells me they're thorough. It lets me know their level of professionalism. And all of that is really important to me because as a prosecutor, it's great to have the facts in a file, but if I don't have witnesses that can put those facts in front of a jury, they don't help me. So I'm gauging, even in my prosecution summary, how's this person going to testify? What kind of witness are they going to be? Are they going to be professional on the stand? Are they going to be thorough? And so all those things are really important and things that a prosecutor will glean from that initial summary.
Wow, that's really helpful. Thank you. I learned so much from that answer. I didn't know anything about prosecution summaries or that whole process. So thank you. What makes domestic violence cases more difficult to ensure this kind of level of prosecution summary and the legal level of legal standard?
Well, both Heather and John have given you some of the things that make different domestic violence cases very different. I'm going to reiterate a few of those things briefly. First, as it's already been mentioned, domestic violence cases are some of the most dangerous calls that law enforcement are dispatched to. The reason that's important for the question you specifically asked me, which is what makes these cases more difficult to ensure that we can prove them beyond a reasonable doubt, is that law enforcement, when they arrive on the scene and they know it's a domestic violence call, as John mentioned and Heather mentioned, they are already on a heightened level of alert. And they're on a heightened level of alert for everything that could happen related to their safety and the safety to the others that are on the scene. Now, that's important because that's the law enforcement officer's primary focus when they arrive on the scene, and that's what it should be. But sometimes, because they're really focused on how dangerous this situation is, they may miss some other things that could be of evidentiary value, at least until they're able to secure the scene and make sure that they're safe and that the witnesses and victims and others that are present are safe. Subsequent to that, often victims and witnesses that are on the scene of domestic violence cases are experiencing great trauma. And that's really important because when someone is experiencing trauma, the way that they communicate, the way that they share what has happened to them or what they observed is different from someone that is not experiencing trauma. And people experience trauma in different ways, and it shows itself in different ways. And so sometimes when people are in high stress and very traumatic situations, as most domestic violence situations are, they're not able to fully express everything in a sequential format in a manner that makes perfect sense because they're processing that trauma in their brain and frankly in their body as well. This can cause issues for law enforcement when they're trying to obtain a certain level of detail that they need in an interview or in a statement. It can also, for law enforcement that may not be trained about people that are experiencing trauma, they may see the way that that victim or those witnesses are interacting and process that, not understanding that it's the effect of trauma and thinking that it may be something else going on with the victim. Maybe they think they're not being honest, or maybe they think they're not being fully forthcoming, when it could really just be a processing of trauma that's going on. So that makes it more difficult for law enforcement to really get the level of detail that they need in interviews and from statements. Because these cases are intimate and they're personal, and the victims are often spouses or significant others of offenders, and the witnesses, if there are other witnesses that are present, they're often children, sometimes other family members or close friends. Because of that, that often also causes a reluctance on the part of victims and witnesses to participate, even on the scene, even after something terrible and traumatic and often very physically abusive has happened to them. They're reluctant to give the officers the information they need for a variety of reasons. And there's some more experts like Monica that are on with us today that can give us some additional information about that. But because of that reluctance, that's why photos that John was talking about, body cam recordings, they're so important, because sometimes, and I'll get to this in just a minute, we're going to have to prosecute these cases without the victim's testimony. And so we need to think through that. And a lot of times prosecutors that handle or are new handling domestic violence cases, that really concerns them. Since I've been doing this a while and I've prosecuted a lot of homicide cases, I never have a victim that testifies in those homicide cases. So I know we can move forward without the testimony of a victim, but we need law enforcement to bring us the evidence that's present. And law enforcement has to assume, and this is what I train them, when you arrive at a domestic violence scene, I want you to assume that that victim's not going to testify for me. I want you to assume that those witnesses might not testify, the children might not testify, the other family members might not testify. And so I need you to bring me as much physical evidence as you can so that I don't have to force that victim to testify if that's not in their best interest and not what they want to do. And so we need to make sure that we have those photos, those body cam recordings, other digital evidence, like from cell phones, is often very critical, and cell phone records. But even if officers are able to get past these understandable obstacles and they're able to get a full and complete investigation on the scene, as I sort of prefaced, often victims and witnesses will recant those statements at a later point. So even if they're fully able to participate and involved and want to participate at the scene, at a later point, again, for a variety of different reasons that I bet Monica will talk to us about in a little bit, they decide that they don't want to or don't feel like that they can participate in the prosecution of the offender. So for all of these reasons, follow-up of initial investigation is really important. If you have a victim that is willing to participate in the investigation, it makes it even more important that law enforcement remain connected to that victim throughout the investigative process until we get to trial, which oftentimes will be a long time. It also is important to get them plugged in with other resources. So the intimacy, the personal nature, the danger of these types of cases really make it more difficult oftentimes for us to reach our beyond a reasonable doubt standard, at least with standard regular testimony. So we're going to have a little more.
Really helpful. Thank you so much, Kimberly. I do want to transition over to speaking with Monica next. Monica, thanks so much for being here. We still
absolutely.
Oh,
thank you for having me. Yes,
of course. I did want to just kind of let's transition over to kind of picking up where Kimberly kind of was chatting about the reasons that someone may not want to be cooperative with the investigation or testify. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
What I can add is we have to also consider the cultural influences that may impact a person's desire to move forward from a legal perspective. We have to think about the ethical standards that are in place sometimes within systems of families, different groups, the Latino community, the African American community, other marginalized groups, that impacts how and why they don't, and why we don't often call the police or ask for help outside of, extended family and things of that nature. So a lot of that plays a role in if people follow through with that prosecution process. The other thing that impacts is sometimes the initial call, how the system responds the first time when a victim calls will impact if another call will be made when help is needed. So oftentimes if there's been like in cases where there's a repeat, when people come in and they are needing services again, and if they experience, have a bad experience the first time, the likelihood of them calling back for services or even calling the police again are slim. That impacts also.
Very helpful. Thank you for that. Next question for you would be, what is the goal of victim advocacy when supporting a victim of domestic violence as their case is being processed through the criminal justice system? How does the advocate kind of support them?
Advocates are a jewel for victims and survivors of domestic violence. What we find at Safe Space is that our advocates are a source of support, and they act as a liaison between the criminal justice system, the police, and the client. Again, going back to considering services from a perspective of sometimes the clients don't understand the criminal justice system. It is very, very complex. So the victim advocate is a professional who provides that support to the survivor so that they are able to navigate through and have someone they can just really be transparent and vulnerable with through that process. And then we're dealing with people who are afraid and who are having to make a very difficult choice that they may not want to make. And with that in mind, the advocate can help provide some vital resources because their aim is not only to help the victim navigate through the system, but also give the information that's needed to the lawyers discussing legal rights, giving them information about victim compensation. All of those things are important to helping the survivor and the victim understand what the process will look like. And also, sometimes we forget about the financial barriers that impact a victim's ability to move forward through the criminal justice system. Having to go back and forth to court, the cost of gas, missing work, childcare issues, all of those things impact what a person is able to do and how they're able to move forward. So that victim advocate is able to provide resources if there's a need to address those issues, those socioeconomic issues that may impact that process. They're there as a resource. So that is the goal, is to just help that victim go through that system as easily as they can and be just a resource and an emotional support for that victim.
Yeah. You kind of touched in on the next question I wanted to ask, but I'll see if there's anything else you want to elaborate on, which is just what would be helpful for law enforcement and prosecutors to understand about the safety of victims and the challenges they face as they're processed through the criminal justice system.
That's a big question. And it takes a comprehensive approach. It takes collaboration also. Somehow we've got to get connected, from the DV service agencies to the prosecution's office, law enforcement, 911 dispatchers. And I can say in Franklin County, where Safe Space is located, we have a fairly good relationship with our law enforcement entities. So I would just, what is needed is that level of collaboration where you can just pick up the phone and say, hey, Kim, I got a quick question about this case. Or, hey, Heather, is it possible that we can get a copy of the 911 call to help the DV unit that may need some information? And then, the advocate, again, playing that role to help the client understand. But I think for law enforcement, one of the other things that's needed and the challenges they face, again, as Kim said, about the safety when they go out on the call, but also it's just a huge iceberg. And sometimes we forget that we're dealing with a human that's afraid because we're caught up in the process and the process and the process. And so sometimes it's just a matter of breathing, taking just a moment to pause as we're separating and gathering information, to remember that this is a human being that we're working with that is in need of services, and to operate from a place of empathy and understanding where that person may or may not be in that evolutionary process of change. So just a kind of a shift in the mindset and even in training for law enforcement entities may be necessary in order for there to be just a greater response mechanism for when law enforcement goes out, dealing with their own emotions and feelings around it, and then understanding trauma. As Kim said, sometimes a traumatic response for African-American woman is not the same as a woman that is Spanish speaking or a Caucasian American. So it's important for us to recognize again that those aspects of what that response to what they're experiencing looks like.
Very helpful. Thank you so much, Monica. I'm going to switch back over to John. So with what Kimberly just spoke about, what would make a difference for law enforcement and domestic violence cases in those thousands of calls and that much experience? So call after call, home after home, what would make a difference?
First off, those are two mic drop moments, what Kimberly answered and what Monica just said. And I hope everybody listened, because those answers were just empathetic and unbelievable. I really appreciate both of those. What I'm going to say is really hard. And I appreciate the fact that you brought up the mental capacity and emotional capacity of law enforcement, because they too are people and they're trying to figure it out as best they can and manage their emotions too. It is difficult to see some of the things you see on these scenes. What I'm going to say is hard, actually, because it seems very cold. What law enforcement needs is cooperation, honesty, and a key tactic in these situations for us is to do exactly what Monica just said: slow things down. Once you get in and slow things down, you can make better decisions. You can deal with emotional situations. Now, deal with is different than fix, repair, or make sure it doesn't happen again. We're looking for that evidence, and we need to then have people take action on it. That's easier said than done, because I can give you a couple of stories very quickly that, I remember talking to a domestic violence victim, and I was at her house the third or fourth time individually. Now that's different, because it's rare you get the same police officer to the same house, because there's many police officers who then she has to tell the same story, or he has to tell the same story over and over and over. But I dealt with this lady 3 or 4 times, and she was a clear victim of terrible domestic violence. And I was a young police officer. And I remember the day when I looked at her and I said, why are you going to go back home? You know what he's going to do. He's going to do this to you again. It was a very insensitive, cold, ridiculous question. And she looked at me and she said, where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? Where are my kids going to go? And it was just a moment in time that I'll never forget. But it is an unbelievable response. And we're doing better. You've heard woven through this, a quick response, a compassionate response. We use victim advocates. We are now equipped with co-responders from the mental health side to go with us on these calls. And so we're doing better than we probably have in ever. It's probably not enough. And so the difference is to create the relationship, add the resources to the tool belt that you're giving law enforcement going into these scenes, knowing full well we're there to help people. We need to train our law enforcement to be more compassionate, to be human, to understand, and not make it a process driven. And what happens in a lot of cases is you have to finish up something because something else is waiting. And that gets in the way of finding that key piece of evidence. That gets in the way of helping a person and connecting with what those resources might be. But I'm really proud of our co-responder unit that are really focused on helping victims past what happens. But I also know that at the scene, when decisions are made, emotions are going to happen and you have to take care of people. So if the intention is then to arrest who you have probable cause for in the situation, it's best to separate out the victim and the kids from that so they don't have to see it, they won't get emotional, and it continues to traumatize them. So we need that level of cooperation as we begin to kind of take control of the scene, which some people don't want us to take control of the scene, but we're trying to mitigate and really understand, and in a very simple time stamp date process, help people the best we can at the time, and then get a case that we can prosecute. Key answer is we need cooperation.
Yeah. Some of the chats that I kind of saw come in as you were speaking, the quote of just, leaving is a process, not an event. And, something that sounds like you kind of learned in that moment. And also just in something that you are keenly aware of, I'm sure, is that leaving is a very dangerous time. So just wanted to kind of add those to the conversation. Another question is, and you kind of touched on this with the mandatory arrest law, so maybe we've already answered this in full, but what laws are in place on domestic violence in the state of Colorado, because that's what you're familiar with, to determine if an arrest should be made at the scene when law enforcement officers determine an arrest is happening or not?
We have in Colorado, like you said, we have a mandatory arrest, and I've talked about that. And if we have probable cause, we must make an arrest, and then we have to gather the evidence to substantiate getting hopefully a conviction if and when it gets to trial.
Yeah. Are there any other laws throughout the country that you're aware of that people should understand?
It's all
local to their
handled.
situation?
There are laws in different states and they handle it differently. And I'm been in law enforcement long enough to have done law enforcement before the mandatory arrest. And I can see pros and cons to both sides of that, even since that was instituted. It creates an immediate challenge where the victims may even experience, I don't want him arrested. I'm telling you not to arrest him. And then you put law enforcement in an unbelievably difficult situation because they have to. It is a process that's driven by state law, by policy, and officers will follow it based on the policy that's created by law.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks, John. I'm going to turn back over to Kimberly for a few questions. Starting with what is the most challenging aspect of presenting a case to a jury in a noticeably clear domestic violence case when there is plenty of discovery, witness statements, the victim is cooperative, and law enforcement and prosecution have a very solid story for the jury. So, kind of a seemingly best case scenario, what are the challenges that are still out there?
Well, you've given me a strong case to start with. You've said my victim's cooperative, law enforcement's done a very thorough and complete investigation. I've got a solid story. And so that's a wonderful place to start. I will tell you that it is rare that you have all of those components because we're people. And the victims are people, law enforcement are people. And anytime that you're dealing with people, you're never going to have a perfect case. But that's a really good, solid place to start from. But there's still obstacles. And one is the nature of this type of crime. And we just need to be very honest about that. The intimate nature, the private nature, the familial nature of this type of crime simply creates an obstacle. And I want to be very honest and transparent and talk about that. Just like John was just saying, hey, sometimes you've just got to put it out there. And I want people to understand that in general, jurors who are also people don't want to believe these types of crimes occur. And there's a lot of different reasons they don't want to believe it. They don't want to believe it because they don't want to believe that someone that is supposed to love someone and take care of someone would hurt them in this way. And so that's one of the issues that we have to know is there in the minds of people. Another problem is the unfortunate picture that the media for years has painted and presented that victims make up these kind of situations for some type of personal gain. But that has infiltrated the brains of everybody that watches TV, that has a social media account. What we're seeing right now on the media every day is a very highly publicized domestic violence situation. And we see people on TikTok and Facebook and Instagram making fun of it every day and forming their own opinions about what they think happened. And those types of situations, and I'm not making a judgment call at all about the facts of that particular case. I don't have that file. I've not been able to review it. But what I will say is the media takes the pieces they want to take to present what they want to present and to send the message they want to send. And that's a very real thing that we have to deal with. It's a perception that jurors have when they come into a trial. And we have to think about that. Jurors, as I mentioned before, are also people. So when they're sitting in that jury box, they bring their own experiences, they bring their own perceptions, and they bring their own biases to the table. There are people that have a very definite thought in their mind that if this happened to them, this is how they would handle it. And so therefore they don't believe that the story, if you will, of the victim, because no one would act that way because they don't understand trauma. They don't understand this particular situation. And so that's a real thing that prosecutors have to deal with, is understanding that people bring those own experiences, perceptions, and biases into the jury process and into the trial process. And as a prosecutor, it's my responsibility during jury selection to talk about those things, to dig into people's experiences and perceptions. And that's not an easy thing to do because people don't want to hang out their own dirty laundry and they don't don't want to talk about how they really feel, but I have to figure that out. And then I have to also recognize that some people haven't told me the truth during the jury selection process. They just haven't told me those things, maybe sometimes because they don't even realize them themselves. And so those components of jurors bringing those elements in, regardless of how strong our case is an obstacle. And then the last thing I want to mention is defense attorneys. And it doesn't matter how good your case is, the defense attorney has a role. And what they teach us in law school is if you can't attack the law, then you attack the facts. And if you can't attack the facts or the law, then you attack the witness. And since you set up in the question that pretty much we have a strong case, so there's no legal thing for the defense to attack, and there's no factual evidence for the defendant to attack or the defense to attack, we have to expect that they're going to attack our witnesses. And specifically in domestic violence cases, defense attorneys put hard pushes on victims who are willing to testify. And I watch them try to turn their stories. I watch them try to reach in and grab their hearts and create a sympathy factor for their client in front of jurors. And so that's a real thing too. So even when you have an incredibly strong case and you've got everybody participating and everybody doing the best job they can do, no case is perfect, and we have to understand that.
Yeah. Wow, that's really helpful. Thank you. One more question for you. So can you just describe the interview process of a victim if law enforcement has found evidence that a crime has occurred and arrest has been made?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And that's going to look differently depending on the facts of every case. So I think that's really important. So I'll just talk in generalities. First, it's best if we can have an interview that happens on the scene right after everything has happened. But again, understanding, as Monica talked about, as I mentioned, as John talked about, and Heather's also referenced, that you may not get a full complete picture from that interview, but it's good if we can get some initial statements. So law enforcement also, it's so important that when they find that physical evidence, that they are able to corroborate what victims tell them with evidence that's at the scene for the same reasons that I talked about before. And then the interview process should always be a follow-up, and oftentimes more than one follow-up. And that's because, again, as people work through their own trauma, as they work through the impact that trauma is having on their lives, they are able to remember things that maybe they weren't able to remember initially. And so it's important in these types of cases, because they are so close to the heart, that we have a process that gets as much information as we can, that a law enforcement then looks for the physical evidence to corroborate the statements, and then that they follow up, and then that they continue to look for additional corroboration every time they're able to get information.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to turn back over to Monica. I wanted to touch on this idea that, repeat offender or repeat, victims of domestic violence, obviously, this idea that if they're interacting with law enforcement on a regular basis is what I'll say. Is there anything that you do to advise, victims and survivors as they interact with law enforcement, multiple times?
Not really advise. What we try to do is we try actually to help law enforcement understand that they may have cases that are repeat, because of one thing that we have to understand, again, like Kim was saying about the sensitive nature, the intimate partner connection, who wants their relationship to end. Sometimes folks don't even recognize they're in domestic violence situations because there's so many different forms beyond physical. What we try to do is help our law enforcement entities understand that that is part of the nature of the work. We see research that says it takes a victim 7 to 10 times before they get to that place as they contemplate change. As John stated, the question of where do I go from here? We hear a lot in our community, why don't you just leave? And my argument is always, okay, community, what place have you made safe for the victim to be able to go? And beyond shelter, where then is there a place in the community where a person can start over within 30 to 60 days and be financially set and sound and able to provide for their basic needs? So our community answers back, nowhere. So we try to train our law enforcement entities so they understand that the journey is not cut and dry, that we're dealing with, again, a huge iceberg when it comes to relationships. And we also have to understand, as professionals and experts as we are, that something we learned from Lundy Bancroft when he presented to us, why does he do that? We're dealing with perpetrators who use coercive control. So no matter what that victim does, the perpetrator of domestic violence is going to do whatever he or she can to maintain that level of control.
Mhm.
And so that's going to impact whether a person is a repeat or not. It may not be just I'm going back because I'm in love or whatever reason. It may be barriers financially. It may be who's going to watch my kids. What resources will I have? Where will I live? And also fear. Again, I'll say it 100 times over. It shows up in different ways, and overcoming that fear and being able to make choices is a process. It is a process. Yes, John, I saw your hand.
Ashley, if I can make a comment
Yeah,
in support
please.
of that, unbelievably important. We have to train our law enforcement officers what the definition of domestic violence really is. Okay, so in Colorado, it is defined by some very specific words that Monica just said: coercion, control, intimidation, punishment, and revenge. Those 5 things are in statute. Now, she also said a very important point, and I've seen a young police officer ask a victim, when's the last time you guys had sex, to try and establish intimacy. Are you intimate? And intimacy is so far past sexual contact that you have to have officers understand it at a different level. Officers who aren't married, officers who don't understand and maybe have never been involved really in that level of a relationship. But when you start saying, okay, do we have coercion, control, punishment, revenge, or intimidation? That's the basic foundation that you're asking law enforcement to establish, be able to articulate, write down somehow to prove. Monica eloquently just said what we need by policy and law, the decision that has to be made at the scene. That was beautiful. Well done, Monica.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you both. I do want to give Heather some time to speak a little bit here. Can you maybe share a little bit of what is the telecommunicators' role in collecting discovery for a court proceeding?
Yeah, it's it's a multifaceted question for response. The first thing is you have to have trained telecommunicators to appropriately call take, to be able to ask the right questions, to ask questions that will allow the caller to give information. All lines in a 911 center are recorded, and all of the recordings that are coming in through those telephone and radio communications are potential discovery events. And so the first step is in the call taking process. What data or media are we able to collect from the initial conversation? The second thing is when, let's say, John goes out and he's, made this arrest, and there's a criminal case that has to come up, and now he needs his DA packet put together. He'll come and he'll ask from the 911 center, I like to get all the calls, from this location in the last 2 years, 5 years, or within this last incident in specific. Or he also may include, requesting all of the radio communications between law enforcement. If it's a medical, let's say it's a victim who has been assaulted where emergency medical services have to respond, or firefighters for first responders, he may also request all of the radio communications between all of those disciplines, that are on separate frequencies of their own that he may need to review, in addition to the 911 call itself from the victim or the caller, and also all the other callers or witnesses that may be calling into 911. So it's a lengthy process from a director standpoint to have to pull all of this audio, all of these files, to ensure that we're including everything that is being specific to this particular case or incident. And then getting all of that over to John is another challenge because our systems, they seem to not speak together. And so he may have to come to my office and pick it up. I may have to provide it, like to Kimberly, for example, in the DA packet, she may ask for CD or the audio recordings, and the method and manner and how I deliver that to her. She may or may not be able to play that on her side, depending on whatever technology she may have access to. So it creates for, some time restraints and some inefficiencies there when you're trying to pull all of this, because the call originates with the 911 center and it's processing through the 911 center into dispatching of your responders. And so being able to provide all that is very challenging at times, when you're dealing with multiple systems and multiple requests that may be coming in for the information. I'm not able to hear you, Ashley.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to make sure that we kind of touch in on the discoverable process and how, law enforcement kind of plays a role in that. But Kimberly, if you could just chat about that discovery process and maybe even tailoring your answer to a reason that a public defender or defense would claim a discovery violation, and what is the prosecution doing to mitigate these? Could you speak to that?
Absolutely. And I think Heather just brought up some of the things that I would share. So I'll just briefly reiterate some of those things. One of the main reasons that the defense makes a discovery violation, and actually I'd say there's two main reasons. One is there's something in the file that indicates that there is some kind of evidence that is not provided. So for example, there may be a mention of a body cam recording, but the body cam recording is not transmitted from law enforcement to the prosecutor. So it's in the file, it's supposed to be there, but the prosecution doesn't have it. And so therefore they have not been able to provide it to the defense. So a lot of times they'll make a claim of a discovery violation based on something that's in writing, but it's another piece of evidence that they don't have. And sometimes it'll just be clearly there was a 911 call, but we don't have that. For example, Heather just mentioned that. The next reason that that defense will make a valid, even if you will, discovery violation allegation is when they get materials that they can't see, they can't hear. There are a variety, as Heather mentioned, different formats of files, and we have such an increase in digital discovery right now. In almost every case that we have, there is some type of digital discovery. That didn't used to be the case, but it is now. So whether it is a misdemeanor offense or it is a capital murder case, there is going to be a ton of discovery and digital discovery. And for prosecutors, for example, we really focus a lot on the security of our computer systems. Law enforcement do as well. And so a lot of times we're not able to add players to our computers that will allow us to play certain types of digital files. And the defense have even less support often than the prosecutors do to be able to actually view the files. So we may provide them to them, but they'll make allegations, and sometimes rightfully so, that they've got the image, but they can't open it, or they've got the recording, but they can't listen to it. So a lot of times what prosecutors would like to do, and I know that EBodyguard has the ability to do some of this stuff, but most discovery platforms don't, is to bring in digital information and immediately put it into a format like an MP4 or something like that that can be played on almost any device. And so that's something that prosecutors are working to try to do. But discovery violations are really serious, and there are a lot of sanctions that could happen from them. Anything from ranging from an order from the court to provide the discovery all the way to a continuance being issued, exclusion of the evidence. Sometimes the judge will just exclude the evidence because it wasn't provided or wasn't provided in a timely fashion. And a judge can even dismiss a case with prejudice or without prejudice. And without prejudice means we might be able to recharge it, but with prejudice means we won't be able to. And this situation, I think it's really important for everybody in the system. This goes back to something Monica mentioned about the great need for communication. It's really important for everybody to understand the sanctions individually that could happen to a prosecutor. A prosecutor could be fined for not providing discovery. A prosecutor could also be found in contempt for not providing discovery. And depending on the violation, we've had some mention about ethics in the work that we do. A prosecutor could be reported to their licensing agency, so to their state bar, and prosecutors have lost their law license over discovery violations. And so this is a really serious part of the work that we do, because it can tank a case. It can keep a victim from receiving justice. And then, as I mentioned, there can also be personal repercussions for prosecutors and law enforcement if there are validated discovery violations.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. I want to make sure John has some time to speak on some things. John, I'm going to ask you to unmute here and ask you a quick question about how do law enforcement officers ensure the chain of custody for physical as well as digital evidence and discovery?
The chain of custody is critically important in that question, and it is the answer, really, because every single item requires the absolute control for chain of custody. So when an officer picks up that weapon that they're going to recover, they're going to sign a piece of paper that says they have taken control of it and put it into evidence. If someone in evidence then processes it, they have to sign it that they've received it, and then they're doing something with it, like sending it to the lab. When the lab gets it, the lab is going to receive it and then do what they're going to do and then send it back to the police department. A records technician or a evidence technician is going to sign that they've received it. And what's critically important is every one of those people may have to testify to touching that piece of evidence and their role with that piece of evidence, so that it becomes admissible as a piece of evidence. And if you lose that chain of custody, it will become inadmissible, and a situation could then be that the case is dismissed at the worst possible outcome. But every piece of evidence is itemized. Usually there is a picture taken of it before it is recovered, so that we can document the crime scene or where it was located. And then all of those things are put into a property room after they're itemized, to then provide the control and processing for whatever happens past that. It is a process that starts at the crime scene, even before with a 911 call, and then law enforcement has to pull it all together, gather it, and ensure that there is structure and security around every single item. It's not okay just to take that item and throw it in the back of the police car and go to the next call. Then you go to the next call and you just sort it all out. You have to be able to say that you had physical custody and it is secure with you the entire time.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. Kimberly, anything to add to that process, the chain of custody with evidence from start to finish?
I think John hit the nail on the head. It's just important in a criminal situation. I'm going to have to be able to prove that this evidence has been secured, that it's not been altered, and I'm going to have to show that. And barring there being some stipulation from the defense, that chain of custody is going to be critical, sometimes for the admissibility of evidence, but always for the weight that evidence is given. If we have a break in that chain of custody, even if we're able to get that admitted, the defense is able to poke holes in that process. And so it's really important.
Yeah.
Now, actually, you added one piece to that with the discovery process. So here in Colorado, we're very fortunate because we have an e-discovery process where all of our reports, our pictures, our videos, they're all sent by e-discovery, which Melissa Faith Hart created through EBodyguard. But a long time ago, in like 2014, we implemented across the state an electronic discovery process that does this to all of our prosecuting attorneys' offices. And it immediately created efficiencies. It immediately reduced the discovery problems, and it immediately improved the efficiencies and operating parts of the entire system, because it can be done and tracked and handled electronically, as opposed to paper and pen and driving things somewhere.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I want to really shed some light on the relationship between, I feel like in past webinars, we've really talked about how 911 telecommunicators kind of interact with law enforcement, but could we really kind of unpack the working relationship between prosecutors and law enforcement? This question is for both John and Kimberly. I don't know, John, do you want to start off, and then we'll move over to Kimberly for any other additional thoughts?
I would just say that it is critical, and it is really important that this relationship be strong long before any of the cases are filed. So your chiefs of police are going to be reaching out to your district attorneys. There's in some states challenges because district attorneys are elected and change. Chiefs of police change, sheriffs change as well. But it's the relationship that allows everyone to do their work beneath them. And if that relationship isn't there, and you can't pick up the phone and you say, hey, Kimberly, it's John, give me a call because I got a question about a case, and she can do the same thing backwards, there will be failures. And we're very fortunate because we have a great relationship, but there's no room for animosity, egos. Now you might find that hard to believe with some of these charged roles, but you got to set your egos and check them at the door was my standard as a chief of police. Sit down and have an open conversation about what you're needing to do, and then be really honest with people about how you're feeling and what you're getting in return. And that is the critical case, because what we have to balance is the cost is to the victims. It's not to us. The truth is we got to go on to the next file and the next case and the next process or whatever. And that's a harsh reality. But what we have to continue to keep at the front of this is there is a victim, a human being that is attached to this case that deserves more than sometimes they get.
Yeah. Kimberly, anything to add to that in terms of the relationship?
I'd just start by saying the root of any relationship, no matter what it is trust. And when you know that the root of a relationship is trust, that highlights even more why the relationship between prosecutors and law enforcement are so critical at every phase, because we have to be able to trust each other. We have to be able to trust each other, and we have to believe that people are coming to whatever question they're asking from the right perspective. And what I mean by that is, John just mentioned, law enforcement are moving to the next case. So are prosecutors. So when I call John and I say, John, I need you to look at that case from 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to need you to do X, Y, and Z. He has to know that I'm asking for that because I need it, because I want to be able to seek justice for this victim. And it's not just something I want, it's something that I feel like I need for us to push this thing past the finish line. And when John tells me, Kimberly, it's not there, I can't get it. I'll go do whatever you want me to do, but it's not going to be there. I have to trust that he's not just being lazy, trying to move to another case, but that he's professional. He knows his work and he knows what he has to do. And I have to understand that as well. And so this core of trust is so critical. Also, another piece of this relationship comes with training. And I am a strong supporter in cross-training and multidisciplinary training, because it is so important for me to understand the obstacles that John faces, that law enforcement face when they go into these situations. And it's easy for me to Monday morning quarterback an investigation that happened over the weekend, but I wasn't there. And so I need to understand his role, his responsibility, their obstacles. And the same thing with John. He needs to understand the obstacles that I am facing in a court of law, what my standards of proof are, what challenges I have getting evidence admitted, and the chain of custody issues that we talked about before. And so cross-training and multidisciplinary training is so important to understand the processes of the other part of your team. And the truth of the matter is, law enforcement and prosecutors 95% of the time are going to be on the same team, moving in the same direction, and they should be. Do I have a different standard of proof than law enforcement has to charge? Absolutely. But we can't push these cases across the finish line. We can't ensure the safety of victims, and we can't ensure the confidence of the community if we don't work together. And so we have to have good working relationships so that we can work through any issue. And, when you start that process early on in your career as a prosecutor or a law enforcement officer, it allows it to grow. Some of the folks that I work with now that are detectives, we started out together when, I was a brand new prosecutor and they were doing patrol. And then I also think it's important for us to understand these relationships need to extend outside of just prosecutors and law enforcement to other allied partners, to people like Monica who do the work that she does, so we can understand a victim perspective from that piece. And oftentimes victim advocates people that work with victims have the ability in outside agencies to contact them and connect with them in ways that I can't, because they're communicating with them more frequently. And so if I have that relationship with Monica, then she can take the trust that she and I have, and she can give that to the victim so that the victim trusts me as well. And then the same thing is true for Heather Shop and the Telecommunicators. They're the first people that get this evidence and this information, and we need to have, relationships with them as well. So this multidisciplinary approach to justice is the most successful way to keep our community safe, and it's the most successful way to make sure that victims are protected.
Very helpful. Thank you guys so much. So I want to save these last 15 minutes for questions, but just so we make sure that everyone has a chance to maybe say anything that's on their mind, I just want to open it up really quickly. Is there anything else that, in terms of, the law enforcement perspective and domestic violence cases that we haven't touched on today that you want to make sure that we do touch on before we shift over to questions? Everyone's kind of seemingly shaking their head no. Okay, great. Well, let's transfer over to questions. I'm going to pull these up. Thank you to Hannah and Rachel for managing these. We're going to start off with a question to John. How do you get law enforcement to collaborate with other agencies regarding domestic violence situations and plans to leave safely?
I think the victim advocates and co-responders are going to collaborate the most. I don't think there's going to be a lot of interagency collaboration on individual domestic violence calls, because it doesn't work like that. But they could work with an agency where there's another home there. But if there is a connection, then those two agencies should be connected and be working together for the greater good of the victim. But domestic violence generally is not something that is handled jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Great. And thank you to Melissa and Rita for joining in for the Q&A session as well. So this question is directed to Kimberly. We had some questions about the mandatory domestic violence arrest law that John mentioned. How can people find out if their state has a mandatory domestic violence arrest law? Oh, Kimberly, I think you're still on mute.
Probably the easiest way is Google. There's a lot of resources that show who have mandatory reporting and mandatory arrest laws. I would also encourage folks, if they don't know, they can reach out to local law enforcement. They can also reach out to local domestic violence shelters, and other advocacy groups can tell them about that. And they can reach out to their local prosecutor's office to find out if there are mandatory laws. Yeah, fantastic. Melissa and Rita, I wanted to just give you a chance before we continue on with questions. Was there anything as you were listening to today's conversation that kind of was on your mind or that you wanted to say?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted before. I wanted to add to what Kimberly said, in that there are a couple places one can look for what laws you have in your state. The National Congress of State Legislators, I think, is one option to see what laws you have in your state. The other is womenslaw.org. They have a lot of information about domestic violence and sexual assault laws in states. So those are two places that you can check. Listening to this conversation, it was great. You all shared some really important information, and the ability for us to respond to these calls in the most effective way to reduce violence in our community is that we do have to build trust, and we have to build trust with people that intuitively we may not feel trustful of. And so I think if you come to that relationship, understanding that I'm having a hard time struggling here, but I know that we need to work together. So how do we do that effectively? If you don't have an automatic bond with somebody, work through that discomfort that you have, talk about it with each other. Because I think it's critical that we hold abusers accountable. And if we hold abusers accountable, if there are consequences before someone dies, we're all going to be safer. That's just the reality. And so, working within communities that are often treated more harshly or less equally, those are realities that we have to work with within the criminal justice system. But as an advocate, you you have an opportunity and a response that you can change that a little bit in your community. So take that step, support each other in the process as you struggle with each other, but do that piece.
Yeah. Melissa, I want to give you a minute to weigh in, but Monica, is there anything to add to that? Because I feel like that's obviously a perspective that you share with Rita in terms of the advocacy side of things.
Absolutely. And, you know, advocates sometimes don't get the credit that they should as professionals, as the gems that they are. But I think the advocates and the advocacy organizations like Safe Space and others on the training today can really lead the charge for a more coordinated community response. It works. It is a slow process. It is, but working together and going into places sometimes where we're not invited is going to be key if we keep in the forefront of our mind that safety is the lighthouse that light that's going to keep that client safe. And Rita, yes, perpetrator accountability, it's one of the reasons why we have to work together, because there's been so much focus on the victim and why doesn't they leave and all of these things. But we really have to look at why this abuse happens and looking at the root cause of why this violence happens. And just like in Franklin County, we're the only agency that's leading that charge. So it can be done. That's a whole nother training, but definitely joining forces with your community, law enforcement, prosecutors, units and things like that really will make a difference in the outcomes for those victims.
Yeah. Thanks, Monica. Melissa, anything that you wanted to add as you were listening today before we jump back to questions?
Yeah, I just want to say something really simple. Law enforcement enforce the law, and they're looking for evidence in order to be able to make that arrest. And then Kimberly said it really clearly. She said there's more and more volume of cases that they have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So all that being said, if law enforcement is enforcing the law, they need evidence. And so this is why, knowing what we need, I knew we needed to be able to provide the victim voice for that evidence. Working with 911, I know that we've got to be able to give more information to the 911 telecommunicator so that we can give evidence to law enforcement even before they get to that 911 call. So please do not ignore all the advocacy tools that we're handing to you with the safety card, because we're able to give you your voice if you're in the process of violence right now. All right. So we created e-discovery here at EBodyguard. Kimberly knows exactly what she needs as she's looking at that prosecution summary. She works with John Jackson. We've got to build our trust muscles between each other as we are literally working through the process here. Thank you, Ashley, for putting this together with domesticshelters.org. Thank you to all the experts.
Yeah, and thank you, Melissa. I appreciate it. I do want to just turn back over to questions. We have about 7 minutes left. I think this is a really kind of simple question, but one that we really didn't touch on. But how are domestic violence calls handled when children are present? John, could you speak to that?
I can. And one of the key contributing points in our response is to find out if kids are there. We recognize this is going to be harder on the kids than anything, but we try not to include them as witnesses if we can, but sometimes that doesn't happen. We try and separate them as quickly as we can. We try and find family members that they can go to and be as comfortable and as safe as they can be. Unfortunately, obviously, when you say kids, that kind of bumps right up to 18. So if you have a 17-year-old, I've seen situations where 17-year-olds are involved in the abuse and understand and know exactly what's happening and take action against the abuser, because you're not going to do that to my mom anymore, Dad. So sometimes kids are even getting themselves involved in this, and then they become a witness. It is the same with everything. Is we are going to separate it, slow it down, gather the evidence, and figure out where we need to go, understanding these are young minds and hearts that are still being molded that need to be treated a little bit differently sometimes. Yeah.
Thanks for that, John. Next question also for you. in dealing with children. So are officers mandated, and this may vary from state to state, to contact the local child protection agency in the event of domestic violence? Oh, John, can you speak to that? Sorry. Picking on you a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't understand the question. Tell me again.
Oh, yeah. No, you're fine. So I'm wondering, are you, as a police officer, are you required to contact CPS, so Child Protective Services?
There's no mandate by state law, but we have a relationship with them that we will work with them in the furtherance and investigation of the case, but we're not required. Really?
Okay, that's good to understand. So Kimberly, I heard, so this question is, I've heard a lot that there is proof, but not enough proof to prosecute. Being a survivor myself, hearing that can be devastating to a survivor and make it feel as though what they went through was not sufficient enough. How much proof is actually necessary?
That's a hard question to answer because every case is different. And the standard of proof in all criminal cases, no matter where we are, is going to be beyond a reasonable doubt. How we reach that standard of proof is going to depend on the evidence we have in each individual case. But what I want to say to the person that asked the question is, I cannot imagine how frustrating it is as a survivor for someone to say, I don't think that we can get to that standard of proof in a criminal court. And what I want to also encourage survivors to understand is that oftentimes, if we will work together as a team, this multidisciplinary approach to justice is what will allow us to gather enough evidence to push these cases past the finish line. So I wish I could give you a hard and fast answer. This is enough proof and this is not, but it really is dependent on the facts in every case and the ability to get that evidence admitted. I also want folks to understand that there are a lot of times that as a prosecutor, I look at a case, I 150% believe it happened. I believe the victim and I believe the witnesses, but for a variety of reasons, sometimes even if law enforcement has collected the evidence for me, I can't use the evidence. Sometimes there are hearings where judges decide that certain evidence is not going to come in or that they're not going to admit that evidence in front of themselves if it's a bench trial or a judge trial or in front of a jury. And so I also want to say to victims and to survivors and to witnesses and to people that work with victims and survivors that just because a case isn't pushed through the criminal justice system does not mean that the prosecutor and the investigatory agency doesn't believe it happens, but that there are a lot of factors that go into what actually can be presented in a court of law. And these type of discussions, as Melissa said, that we're having today, and innovative technology like e-BodyGuard and other things that are out there help us build these cases stronger. We have more resources now than we've ever had to put cases together and to put evidence together. And so we're thankful for those advances in technology because they make our jobs easier and they allow us to seek justice in more cases.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I do want to acknowledge that we do have some outstanding questions on the Q&A, but I do encourage, some of them look like they could have been answered by watching some of our previous webinars. So encourage everyone to check out our webinar archive where you can see the previous 2 webinars we've done with this panel and some other experts to make sure that you have a full picture of the 911 telecommunicators perspective and other things. So I encourage everyone to go check that out, but we have a little bit less than a minute left. So I wanted, probably not time for everyone to speak, but maybe John, since we're focusing on law enforcement today, is there anything that you want to kind of say, make sure that advocates understand, make sure that domestic violence professionals understand about the law enforcement response?
I think what I would like everybody to understand is that law enforcement really is trying and doing the best it can. Every law enforcement agency that I have been in part of, and I've been a chief of a couple, we've always set the bar to help people in their time of need. Sometimes that looks differently than what some people want, but I would just encourage you to do the outreach to your local police department or sheriff's office. Establish that relationship, which builds that trust. These are the very basic principles of what we've talked about today. And get them to see you law enforcement isn't as good as it should be. It is better than it's ever been. Now, that can be debated by a lot of people, but there are a lot of professional law enforcement officers that are standing ready to help you. They just need to know how best, when, and what they can do. And so I would just encourage you to not give up, not give in, and don't ever let someone hurt or abuse you because you don't deserve it.
Thanks, John. And thank you to all of our panelists today. I really appreciate you taking the time. Some really, really great information shared today. And then thank you to everyone who tuned in today. We had a great audience of people, and thanks for the questions as well. Just a quick reminder that the webinar was recorded, and we'll have this uploaded to our website, and we'll send it out to everyone within a week of today. We'll also provide a transcript, a certificate of attendance, and that will all be emailed to everyone, like I said, within a week. If you are a call-in listener, we do not have your email address, so make sure that you send us an email to info@domesticshelters.org to make sure we can send those resources to you. But if you logged into Zoom on your computer, we do have your email address. So with that, like I said, thank you again to everyone, and we'll go ahead and conclude today's presentation. Take care, everyone.